Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be back.
Today we're going to be looking at something that I think is really fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's all about how families around the world do things a little bit differently,
Oh,
and how those differences really make you think about what it means to be a parent.
yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, we've got this awesome article called Cross-Cultural Similarities and Differences in Parenting by Lansford.
I've heard of that one.
Oh yeah, it's from 2022, and it just digs into all these really interesting research findings about how parenting works across different cultures.
Cool.
Yeah, and to make things even more interesting, we're also going to be pulling in some insights from a commentary on Lansford's article by Cabrera, also from 2022, and a study on perfectionism by Feng Kai and Wang.
Sounds like a good mix.
Yeah, so we're going to be diving deep into what's universal about parenting, what's specific to certain cultures, and why those differences matter. All right, so Lansford starts off by talking about this idea of universality versus specificity in parenting.
Oh, okay.
What does that even mean?
So it's basically trying to figure out what parenting behaviors are the same across all cultures
Right.
and which ones are kind of unique to specific cultures.
So some things are universal and some things are specific.
Yeah, and to help explain this, Lansford talks about form and function.
Okay, break that down for me.
Okay, so imagine a mom cooing to her baby.
Oh,
That's the form of the behavior.
okay.
Now, across cultures, this cooing usually encourages the baby to make sounds back.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right, and that helps with their language development.
Okay.
So that would be the function.
Okay, so in that example, both the form, the cooing, and the function, the baby talking back, are pretty much universal.
Exactly.
Gotcha. But then where does the specific part come in?
Good question. So let's take family obligations as an example, something that many cultures really value. For Korean American college students, having strong family obligations actually makes them feel more supported by their parents.
Interesting.
But for European American students, it doesn't have the same effect.
Oh, so it's the same form, the family obligation, but different functions depending on the culture.
Yeah, it's not just about the action itself, but what that action means in that specific culture.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense.
Another example is how we show love.
Okay.
In some cultures, it's all about physical touch, like hugs.
Yeah.
But in others, it might be more about practical support, like helping with a child's education.
So different forms,
Yeah.
but same function,
Exactly.
love and care.
You got it. And I think this highlights how we often misinterpret parenting behaviors because we're
Yeah.
seeing them through our own cultural lens.
Right, what we think is normal might be totally different somewhere else.
Exactly. Lansford gives this great example of how mothers interact with their babies.
Okay.
Japanese mothers tend to keep their babies facing towards themselves,
Right.
which fosters this sense of interdependence. But U.S. mothers often do the opposite, encouraging their babies to look outwards and explore independently.
So different approaches,
Yeah.
but both valid.
Right. It's not about saying one is better. It's about understanding those different cultural goals.
I'm already starting to rethink so many things I thought I knew about parenting.
It's really eye-opening, isn't it?
Yeah, it's we need a whole new language to even talk about it.
Well, it's not about labeling things as good or bad parenting. It's about understanding the cultural context, the why behind those behaviors.
So what actually shapes these different parenting styles?
Lansford talks about the environment and cultural norms playing a big role.
Yeah, the actual place where you live and the beliefs and values of the people around you.
Right. She uses this example of the Yoruba people in Nigeria.
Okay.
They live in a place where food can be really scarce during certain times of the year.
Oh, wow.
So because of that, Yoruba parents teach their kids to be really careful with food and to wait to enjoy the best parts.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want to waste anything if you're not sure when you'll get more.
Right. They even teach them not to visit other families during meal times
Oh, interesting.
and to always eat the most valuable foods last.
It's all about survival in that kind of environment.
Exactly. But in a place where there's always plenty of food, you probably wouldn't see those same parenting practices.
Yeah, it's amazing how much our surroundings can influence how we raise our kids.
It really is. Think about it. How did the environment you grew up in shape your upbringing?
Oh, that's a deep question.
Right? What values or behaviors were emphasized because of where you lived?
Okay, I'm definitely going to be thinking about that one for a while.
Me too. But for now, let's move on to how culture impacts different aspects of parenting.
Okay.
Lansford breaks it down into categories like physical caregiving, cognitive stimulation, and warmth and responsiveness.
All right, let's hear it.
So when it comes to physical caregiving, think about how much babies are held.
Okay.
The Kung infants in Namibia are in constant contact with their mothers.
Wow.
They're carried everywhere.
That's so different from what you see in many Western cultures, where babies spend a lot of time in strollers or car seats.
Right, totally different experiences from the very beginning.
But each one is considered totally normal within its own culture.
Absolutely. And these different expectations continue as kids get older.
Oh, yeah. Lansford even mentions how in some African countries, kids as young as like 6 or 7 are responsible for collecting water for their families.
It's a reality in those environments, and it shows how different cultures have different ideas about what kids can handle at different ages.
Right, and this also ties back to child development.
Exactly. Remember how being able to sit independently actually helps babies learn to sit up faster.
Oh, yeah, it all connects.
So we've talked about physical care, but what about cognitive development?
I was just thinking about that. How do different cultures approach things like learning and stimulation?
We'll get ready for some surprises. Lansford mentions how traditionally Senegalese parents avoided talking directly to their infants.
Why?
They believed it could make them vulnerable to possession by spirits.
Whoa, that's a totally different perspective.
It is, and it shows how deeply cultural beliefs can influence parenting practices.
For sure. And it's not just about talking to babies.
Mm.
Lansford also points out that even something as basic as play is viewed differently across cultures.
Oh, yeah. In some agricultural societies, play is seen as like a waste of time.
Wow.
But in industrialized societies, it's considered super important for development.
Makes you wonder how your own cultural background shaped the way you played as a kid.
Absolutely. It all goes back to those underlying cultural values and beliefs.
So we've covered physical care and cognitive stimulation. What about warmth and responsiveness?
Ah, that's a good one, because even though we tend to think of warmth as like a universal parenting quality, it's actually expressed in many different ways.
So it's not that some cultures are less warm, it's just that they might show it differently.
Exactly. Western cultures might be all about hugs and saying, I love you.
Right.
But in some Asian cultures, warmth might be shown through educational support or practical help.
Different forms, same
Yeah.
function.
Love. It's a theme we see again and again.
Okay, so what about discipline? Are there any universal truths when it comes to that?
Well, even in the realm of discipline, we see a lot of variation.
Okay,
Lansford talks about the difference between behavioral control and psychological control.
I'm listening.
Psychological control involves things like guilt trips and love withdrawal, and it's generally seen as harmful across cultures.
That makes sense.
But when it comes to behavioral control, things like setting rules and limits, that's where it gets a bit more complicated.
Right, because that's where discipline comes in.
Hmm.
And there are definitely some big differences in how cultures handle discipline.
Absolutely. Lansford found this huge range in the use of corporal punishment.
Like spanking?
Yeah, for example, in Albania, almost half of the parents said they only use nonviolent discipline,
Okay.
while in Mongolia, 0% reported doing the same.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is, and it's not just about whether or not corporal punishment is used, it's about the context.
I'll see.
Lansford gives this example of Vietnamese deference rituals, which are kind of intertwined with discipline.
Okay,
These rituals show how discipline isn't always just about punishment.
interesting.
It can be about shaping behavior within a bigger cultural framework.
So much to think about, and we haven't even gotten to perfectionism yet.
We haven't, but don't worry, we'll get there.
All right, so let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and delve into perfectionism and all the other fascinating things Lansford has to say about cross-cultural parenting.
Sounds good. I'm ready for more.
Me too. Stay tuned.
All right, so we're back and ready to dive even deeper into cross-cultural parenting.
I'm ready. My mind is already blown from our last conversation.
I know, right? There's so much to uncover. But remember, we left off talking about these two key ideas that Lansford brings up: cultural normativeness and the legitimacy of parental authority.
Yes, those sound like biggies. Let's start with cultural normativeness.
Okay, so basically it's about how common or typical a certain belief or behavior is within a culture.
Okay, so like, if most parents in a culture think it's important to potty train early, that would be considered normative, even if some people disagree.
Exactly. It's not about right or wrong, but about understanding what's considered normal or expected in that specific context.
And why does this matter for parenting?
Well, because both parents and children interpret things based on those cultural norms. It's like a shared understanding.
I see. So like a parent's behavior might be seen differently by a child if it fits with what's considered normal in their culture.
Precisely. Imagine a parent using a discipline technique that's common in their culture.
Okay.
The child might not see it as a personal attack compared to if the parent did something totally out of the ordinary.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about the action itself, but also about how it's perceived within that cultural context.
Right, it's like a cultural filter that shapes our understanding of things, and Lansford actually found evidence to support this idea.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
So she looked at whether this cultural normativeness thing affects how parenting practices actually impact a child. And one of the things she found was that in cultures where there's a big emphasis on family obligations, like taking care of your elders and stuff,
Okay.
those expectations were linked to better social skills in kids.
So it's not just about having those expectations, but also about whether those expectations are like the norm in that culture.
Right. It's like a cultural buy-in that influences the outcome.
Wow, this is blowing my mind. It's like all those parenting books need a disclaimer saying, hey, this might not apply to you depending on where you're from.
Exactly. It's not one size fits all, but more like, what's the norm in your world?
Okay, so we've tackled cultural normativeness. What about the legitimacy of parental authority?
That's a good one, especially when we're talking about teenagers.
Oh, yeah, I can already sense some teenage rebellion brewing.
It's classic, right? But basically, it comes down to this. What do kids believe parents have the right to make rules about?
And I'm guessing this varies across cultures.
You bet it does. Teenagers everywhere probably think their parents have way less authority than they actually do.
It's part of growing up, right, testing those boundaries.
For sure. But Lansford points out that across cultures, there's more agreement about parental authority when it comes to moral issues.
Like what kind of moral issues?
Things like hurting others or stealing those are usually seen as wrong no matter where you're from.
Yeah, those seem like universal no-nos.
Exactly. But when you get into things like chores or curfew, those conventional issues,
Right.
there might be a bit more pushback from teenagers.
Makes sense. Those are the classic battlegrounds.
Right. And then you've got personal issues like choosing friends or what you wear.
Oh, yeah, that's where the real clashes happen, especially between teenagers and their parents.
It's a tale as old as time, right?
Mhm.
But the interesting thing is that this whole legitimacy thing actually affects how kids turn out.
Really, so if a teenager believes their parents have the right to set certain rules, they're more likely to follow them.
Exactly. It's about that buy-in again. The teen has to see the rule as fair based on their understanding of the parent-child relationship.
So it all goes back to that cultural context.
It always does, and this is where those cross-cultural differences become even more apparent.
You're like, what?
Well, in some cultures, parents might be seen as having authority over their children, even when they're adults.
Wow, that could definitely lead to some tension if the young adult wants to be independent.
It's a potential recipe for conflict for sure, and this whole legitimacy issue really plays a big role in how parents and kids get along across cultures.
It makes you wonder how much of the conflict we see is about actual disagreements versus just different understandings of what's appropriate or acceptable.
That's a great point, and it highlights the importance of understanding those cultural nuances.
So we've talked about these big concepts, but what can we actually do with this knowledge? Lansford doesn't just leave us hanging, right?
She doesn't. She actually talks about how we can apply these insights to things like parenting programs and policies.
Okay, now we're talking. Let's hear it. Okay, so we've explored this whole world of cultural differences in parenting and how those differences really matter. But now I'm curious, what can we actually do with this knowledge?
Well, that's where it gets really exciting, because we can take this understanding and use it to make real change in how we support families all over the world.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Let's start with parenting programs. You know, those programs designed to help parents learn and grow and ultimately help their kids thrive.
Yeah, there are tons of them out there.
Right. But here's the thing. We have to make sure those programs actually fit the cultures they're being used in.
That makes sense. You can't just take a program from one culture and plop it into another and expect it to work the same way.
Exactly. You have to think about the values, the beliefs, the practices of that specific community.
It's all about context.
It really is. Lansford really emphasizes that we need to adapt these programs to fit the local context.
And are there good examples of how this is being done?
Oh, definitely. There are some great models out there. Remember that program we talked about earlier in the Philippines?
The one that was adapted from a program in South Africa?
Yeah, that's the one. It's called Parenting for Lifelong Health, and they use this really cool framework to make sure it was culturally relevant for Filipino families.
So they didn't just translate the materials, they actually thought about how to make them meaningful for that specific culture.
Right, and the best part is they integrated this parenting program into an existing system that was already providing cash assistance to families.
So smart, they were able to reach families who really needed the support and use an existing infrastructure.
Exactly. It's a win-win, and it highlights how important it is to approach this work with cultural sensitivity.
Right. We don't want to come in with this idea that certain parenting styles are wrong or need to be fixed.
We want to empower parents within their own cultural context.
I love that. So we've talked about interventions. What about bigger picture efforts like laws and policies?
That's a crucial piece of the puzzle, too. Lansford talks about parental leave policies as one example.
Okay, those are always a hot topic.
For good reason, countries that offer paid parental leave, especially those that encourage fathers to take leave, see all sorts of positive outcomes.
It makes sense having that time to bond with your baby without the stress of losing income can make a huge difference.
It's not just about the bonding, though. Studies have shown that paid parental leave is linked to more breastfeeding, lower infant mortality, and stronger parent-child relationships down the road.
Wow, those are some serious benefits.
It's about creating a system that supports families from the very beginning.
Okay, so parental leave is one example. What about other policies related to parenting,
Lansford also talks about laws that prohibit corporal punishment.
like spanking?
Right. As of last year, over 60 countries have made it illegal to physically punish children.
That's amazing progress.
It is. But here's the thing. Just passing a law doesn't necessarily change people's deeply held beliefs and behaviors overnight.
Right, you need more than just a law to create real change.
Lansford emphasizes that these laws are most effective when they're combined with education and public awareness campaigns.
So you need to change the laws and change the culture around parenting.
Exactly. It's a two-pronged approach, and it brings us back to that idea of cultural normativeness.
Right, if we can shift what's considered normal and acceptable within a society, it can have a ripple effect.
Absolutely. And that's something to think about as we move forward. How is globalization influencing parenting practices all over the world? What new challenges and opportunities are emerging as different cultures become more interconnected?
That's a fascinating question, and it shows how this conversation is far from over.
We've only scratched the surface, but this deep dive has given us a glimpse into the incredible diversity of parenting experiences around the world.
It's challenged our assumptions and left us with even more questions to ponder.
And that's the beauty of it. There's always more to learn about this amazing journey of raising human beings.
I couldn't agree more, and with that, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic and see what other insights you uncover.
There's a whole world of knowledge out there. Happy exploring, everyone.
Until next time, keep those aha moments coming.